To introduce this evening's speaker, who will be speaking in a series that we have on Buddhist art, sponsored by the Chow family. Professor Lin is an associate professor of art history at the University of Chicago since September.
September.
Since September. Before that, he was at North Carolina Chapel Hill. Before that, at Iowa State.
Yeah, that's right.
And I met him for the first time we formally met was yesterday, but I've known him ever since his book appeared. This big, beautiful, erudite study of Wei-Cheng, which is maybe the first serious study, certainly the best study of Wei-Cheng, which is one of, if not the most important Buddhist pilgrimage site in China. And from our conversation yesterday, I know now that Professor Lin is working on more projects than I can count, ranging from a study of art collecting, the politics of art collecting in China in the 1930s. He's working on the appropriation of traditional architecture in modern contemporary China. He's working on tomb architecture, on Dunhuang cave paintings, on the Buddhist paintings or Buddhist carvings at Tianlongshan in China, and probably a dozen other that I've slipped my mind for now. And this evening, he's going to turn to yet another project, a subject that's fascinated me personally for some time, on broken images, in a talk entitled "Broken Bodies: The Death of Buddhist Icons and Their Changing Ontology in 10th to 12th Century China." Professor Lin.
Well, thank you, John, for the very nice introduction, and I want to thanks to the whole center for the invitation. I've never been to Stanford, and obviously the weather seems not so as nice as usual. But I'm glad I brought some rain from Chicago here, and Chicago has been raining and snowing, so it's really nice to be here. This project is kind of derived from another things I've been working on, which is on Chinese pagoda. So I've been working on the kind of the architectural part of pagoda buildings for a while already, and I've written an article which should come out next year with the art orientals. And that article is about the kind of ritual practice around inside and outside the pagoda buildings from Tang Dynasty all the way, so it's 7th, 8th century all the way to 12th, 13th centuries. So when I was working on the project, I kept seeing the broken statues being uncovered from the crypts inside the pagodas. And not many people have paid attention to that because they were broken, right? So oftentimes when they were uncovered, and sometimes they're very small parts, just a base or just a torso without heads or stuff like that. The one that you're seeing right here is actually one of the better ones. Can we close the door so there's no, so where is that, a shadow right here? Oh, that's my screen, okay. All right, there you go, okay. All right, so that's better that way. So, and this one is actually a very nice one. Like as you can see the image right here, and then you will see this is actually a more massive kind of the barrier of the broken statues. So because so often that, oh, that's my cup for everything. All right, there you go. So that's the reason, that's how I got into this project, became very interested in knowing the reason why there's a broken statues and what happens to when you have the statues that are broken and they can no longer serve their function. So, and I begin to realize that all the burials were made around the same period, from the 10th through the 12th centuries. So it must have meant something, right? So today the talk will be about this. And before I came, I don't really know what kind of people I will be speaking to. So stop me anytime, or we'll have Q&A at the end. They may have some kind of Buddhist terms or concepts. If you are not so familiar with, we can use the Q&A, and I can, or John can, or anyone else who can help. We can have more discussion later on. And part of this paper will be published next year, sometime after summer, and I'm still revising my final version. So I would love to hear your comments, and then I will include them in my final revision. All right, let me start. So as a Chinese art historian, I show images, right? So, and I think the room is not dim enough for you to fall asleep. So, and I will see you, okay? All right. Okay, so let me start. In 1996, at the former Longxing Monastery located in present-day Qingzhou, Shandong, an underground image hoard was uncovered that yielded more than 400 broken stone statues and stelaes. The majority of them can be dated to the 6th century, with a few exceptions of later periods. But the actual interment did not happen until 500 years later during the Northern Song dynasty. Due to the great number and unusual quality of the sculptures, the Qingzhou hoard has been regarded as one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries in China in recent memory. In spite of the damaged appearance and broken parts, the Qingzhou statues have been exhibited nationally and internationally, representing the achievement of Buddhist art in early medieval China. Modern scholars like us are so used to seeing broken statues that we are often quick to scrutinize the artistic qualities and historical values that the fragmented icons are still able to impart before asking other factual questions. In our case, how these Buddhist icons were broken in the first place is important to ask. But equally important is the question, why did the very interment not occur until the 11th century? In fact, the find of Longxing Monastery was one among many in the Qingzhou area, and more than 1,000 such sculptures have been unearthed in Qingzhou alone. Of these stone sculptures, as exemplified by those from the Longxing Monastery, were seriously damaged at the time of their interment, according to one archaeological report. Many of the broken statues have been reassembled, like the one in your left, while many more do not have all matching parts. One might suspect that the burying of broken sculptures in the underground pits was a regional practice. As it turns out, however, there have been at least 20 reports of similar image hoard discovered in Shandong, which is marked on the map right now, in the past decades. Outside the coastal province, broken sculptures were also found in Hebei, Henan, Anhui, Shanxi, Shanxi, Ningxia, Gansu, and Sichuan, including the most recent find in 2012 of the largest image cache ever discovered in China from Linzhang, Hebei. So the location of the new one is around here in the southern part of the Hebei province. And here is the image of the discovery. So though varied in scale of the burial and number of the buried statues, all examples were entered during the 10th through the 12th centuries. The materials I have been able to amass thus far suggest that rather than regional practice, burying broken statues may have been a consistent and widespread phenomenon that was practiced concurrently in a greater territory of China ruled separately by the Northern Song, Liao, and Tangu Xixia dynasties. So if you remember the purple part in my last map, that will be inside the square right here. So most of the examples that we have thus far were found in this area. So the question is not just how these statues were broken, but also why they were buried, old ones in particular. It is not unheard of in Chinese history that images of deities were destroyed in times of anti-religious persecution. But while the metal used to make icons could be melted and recycled, and to a lesser extent, let's see, I'm sorry, yeah, that's right, and those carved out of wood burnt, broken stone statues, and to a lesser extent, the unfired clay ones were problematic. So you think about the bronze statues, when they were broken, you can melt them. The wooden ones, you can burn them. But when you have stone, when they are broken, they won't disappear. They will be there, so you have to deal with them. So one finds tales from the Tang Dynasty that damaged icons complained to devotees about their broken limbs and fingers and asked for help in repairing them. And we do find evidence of repairs and parts remade. For example, the ones you are seeing right here, this is historical repairment, so it's not done in the modern time. And there are many more examples I can show you, but I'm going to show you one more example. So when you see these two holes right here, they were broken limb, right, and then or arm and put together with the metal. And if you look closely here, this is modern kind of grooves, right? So it's really, really terrible. But you can see the historical mark right here for a little brace to put together the broken head and torso together. So yet, once a broken icon is beyond repair and can no longer serve a function as the one you are seeing right here, it becomes a quote-unquote sacred junk, left in an ontological limbo. And you have, last year I went to the storage of the Qingzhou Museum. You can see there are a lot more broken statues sitting in the storage. And they are sitting there because they are not fit for display in the museum. So their very physical existence, though no longer complete, still demands attention and exerts influence and sacrality. So you have to remember those broken stuff were buried and then put together in modern time. So in the historical period, even they were broken, they were not scattered or dumped away. They were kept together, right? So in this regard, broken statues are simultaneously the sign of the power and the powerlessness of the sacred object. And this might have been the reason that led to the eventual creation of the image hoard, so broken statues could be forever buried. If this were the case, the image hoard must not have been simply storage or discard pit, testified also by the fact that the broken statues were usually arranged in order, and the amount of care used to bury them also indicates the broken icons were more than merely damaged sculptures. So I'm showing you two sites. One is right here. This is buried under, in the monastic site, so it's an underground pit. The other one is the underground crypt under a pagoda. So you can see how at the center there's a little altar type of thing there, and everything's arranged around it. So there's an order in there. So one clue to answering all the questions I have raised by because of the broken statues, maybe one of the answers may be the place of their interment. While those from the Qingzhou hoard and Linzhang cache were buried in an underground pit on the former monastic grounds, many more were interred in the crypts or pagodas, in most cases together with other ritual items. Inside the pagoda crypt, a location traditionally reserved for bodily relics of the Buddha, the broken statues seem to have been treated as relics, as some scholars have suggested. So the suggestion is well taken, but to consider broken icons as relics, two seemingly independent categories of sacred objects, entails some conceptual adjustments. In a broad sense, an icon stands for the presence of the divine to which it refers. If an icon of the Buddha were to turn into relics after broken, the icon would first need to be considered as alive in the physical sense, and its breaking that terminates the aliveness would then signify its death. In other words, the breakage precipitates both the sign redefinition of an icon from the living to dead and its material transformation from an image to relics. So to see this paper proposes to examine the burying of broken icons in light of the concurrent practices in mortuary burials and relic depositories. For in all these cases, the dead, relics, and broken icons, all having lost their integral body, seem to have been set up to assert the bodily presence materially in their respective burial or hidden spaces. I will argue that during the period of our discussion, from the 10th through the 12th centuries, Buddhist icons were conceived as possessing a bodily materiality, and their broken fragments could have been considered as literally embodying the meaning of the Buddhist term, 碎身, or broken body, referring to relics after a physical body had lost its corporeal substance. In other words, the living icon could die and turn into a relic after losing its physical integrity. Yet, as will be demonstrated, the incomplete icon did not die completely, and the death of the image was only to prompt an ontological shift, suggesting the different purposes the broken statues would serve in their burials after death. So, in what follows, accordingly, I will first examine the ways in which icons could be seen as bodies or vice versa, and the conflation of the two different entities that provides the context in which broken icons were taken literally as broken bodies. And second, I will investigate the pagoda crypt. the hidden space of the broken statues with reference to human burial to explore their changing ontology, the changing ontology of broken icons in that space. And I will finally conclude the presentation by looking into the questions raised and implications suggested by the burying of the broken statues. So the first section, the notion relics in terms of icon and body. Relics, by definition, refer to remains or remnants left behind after the body was decayed, disintegrated, or being cremated. In early Buddhism, however, this material leftovers was never a sign of death, but a testimony to a sense or other virtuous being's physical transformation. The primary paradigm of this transformation is certainly the example of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, for whom death and a cremated body was prerequisites necessary for obtaining relics, physical evidence of his entry into nirvana. Likewise, early Chinese Buddhists performed mortuary rituals and procedures to quote-unquote abandon the physical body, or 遗身 in Chinese, in order to have the corporeal remains collected, buried, and enshrined as was done to the Buddha's relics. Most of our early material evidence of Buddhist mortuary practice comes from the stupa-shaped funeral niches sculpted on the cliffs near the Wei-Cheng Monastery at Mount Bao in Henan. Each niche functions as a funeral monument that consists of two sides. Inside, it was built to contain the remains of the deceased monk or nun. Outside, the deceased is identified in the inscriptions carved on the facade of the niche, while his or her portrait in high relief can be seen in the niche. So here you can see how densely they were built together, right? Also all the kind of stupa-shaped the monument. And using this as an example, this will be the area where the inscription will go. So that will provide the identity biographical information. And inside the niche, then you have this kind of the image of the deceased nun or monk in high relief. 2 points about these funeral niches are relevant to our discussion here. First, the majority of the stupa-shaped niches at Mount Bao were named in the inscription Hui Shen Ta, or stupa of bodily ashes. While Hui Shen Ta indicates quite factually their function, another term called Sui Shen Ta, or stupa of broken body, were used interchangeably is more specific. So in this example, the inscription appear right here, and that's a term Sui Shen Ta, where along with the name of the deceased master. So as introduced earlier, the term Sui Shen in Buddhism means bodily relics after the body was broken or corrupted, used especially in relation to Buddha's body at his death. As stated in the Nirvana Sutra, Shakyamuni Buddha, and I quote, broke his body in order to make his followers venerate his relics, end quote, 遂其身而令供养. The application of the term 遂身 thus stresses that the stupa monument celebrates the breaking of the body as a necessary step towards nirvana. And second, the sculpted portrait of the deceased Buddhist, referred to as 影像 or 图形, portrait or image, in the inscription, was likely for memorial purposes. In one example, the term 神仪, or spirited appearance, is used for the image of a deceased monk. It seems to suggest that while the bodily relics, 碎身, or the body that has been broken, were buried inside, the sculptural image of the deceased Buddhist outside could assert its presence and receive veneration. In short, relics and images are linked to the living presence of the Buddha after his death, or deceased Buddhist in our case. And yet, they are also differ from each other in their different forms, locations, and functions. This disparity between them, nevertheless, was not always crystal clear, particularly after entering the Tang Song period. And in many cases, the distance between icons and relics was deliberately negated. An example in this regard is a related but rather different kind of relic known as whole body relics, or 全身舍利. The term refers to mummified monks whose uncorrupted bodies were equated to relics. A notable example is the mummy of the Chan master Huineng, whose body was found still fresh one month after his death and it was lacquered and since has been venerated until today. You can still go see it in China for its resistance to decay. This grossly somatic emphasis in the matter of death seems contradictory to the canonical view of the corporeal body in Buddhism, which sees the physical entity at best as largely impermanent and transient. Robert Schaff, in his research on this topic, however, argues that the practice of whole body relics actually transforms the body into an imperishable icon, which was construed as evidence of the utmost spiritual attainment. Accordingly, the key to the notion of whole body relics in medieval Buddhism was the corporeal body, which remained integral after death and was viewed quite literally as alive. As exemplified in the case of Huineng's body, before lacquered, it was reported that, and I quote, its whole body had not broken, but sat as if in samadhi, end quote, 全身不遂，如入禅定. The notion of whole body relics was thus conceived as the opposite of that of the broken body relics obtained only after the body was corrupted or cremated. More importantly, if the mummified body treated as a new kind of relic was also conceived as an icon or icon of flesh, the previous discrepancy between relic and image and Mountbao was erased. As the practice of the whole body relics became widespread from the Mid-Tang onwards, we begin to find more and more records about artificial mummifications treated with lacquer or clay. One of the most stunning examples is the group of mummies of the previous masters clothed in clay from the monasteries located at Mount Mian in central Shanxi. Addressed as Zhenshen or true body, each of the whole body relics asserts the absolute truth of the deceased master with its own physical likeness, as if still alive. And actually, many of these the mummies are put in the temple building, so they actually sitting there alongside with some other icons. So you have this fresh icon or icon of flesh with the material icons. So, and it does so by unmasking the icon's real substance as none other than the deceased master himself. And therefore, the slippage between the prototype that is in the master and the duplicate, his image, is collapsed. The whole body relic is now literally turned into the icon of the master's true eternal presence. In this light, if we turn around the relationship between relic and icon, we may wonder, could broken icons also be conceived as literally materializing the term 碎身舍利 or broken body relics after the statue lost their physical integrity? Put another way, as the interrelation and conflation of body and icon was critical to the cult of relics in medieval China, whereas the flesh was made into icon, as you are seeing right here, could living icon also be seen as living bodies? And I suggest this might well have been the case in particular when icons were understood also in corporeal terms. In the early history of Chinese Buddhism, images were done to walk and fly or to sweat and weep of their own volition. They intervened in daily life and performed a host of miracles to assert their divine presence. Modern images, one may argue, they were living icons that took a non-corporeal form. Yet their non-corporeal materiality did not stop the Chinese from imagining them corporeally. The Great Book of Marvels, for example, or Guangyi Ji, compiled in the mid-8th century, includes a story of such living or animated icons. The female protagonist of the story, Lady Xi, suddenly fell sick and was on the very brink of death, and she thus donated all her clothes for merits. And when Lady Xi's illness grew more acute, she even traded a precious piece of embroidery given to her by her mother for funds, so she could order the casting of 2 Buddhist statues. She died, however, when the 2 statues were still in the kiln unfinished. Soon after death, Lady Xi was taken by a group of demons in the netherworld, and when they were about to leave, suddenly two people called out from behind and ordered them to release Lady Xi. As they came closer, the faces of the two figures, dirty black and covered with ashes, struck such fear in the demons that they all scattered in terror. Lady Xi was returned home and came back to life. As for the two people, they were actually the newly cast yet unfinished Buddhist statues. So the story certainly should be read with the didactic message in mind. The meritorious deeds of Lady Xi resulted in her resurrection as the karmic reward. But more significantly for our purpose, the casting process was described here as a way of literally bringing the two statues into life in corporeal sense. The body is crucial in the medieval imagination of the divine. This corporeal imagination of the living icon, moreover, was supported in some earlier canonical work. One of the Vinaya texts of Buddhist monastic codes, translated into Chinese in the 5th century, makes it clear, and I quote here, "One should not make half-body statues. If a statue is made without all perfect bodily marks, it should be covered to be remade," end quote. This completeness of the body is required in order to comply with the expectation that a Buddhist image should depict all 32 perfect bodily marks of the Buddha. This, however, should not be taken strictly in an iconographical sense, since the inclusion of all the bodily marks, or 相好具足 in Chinese, was essential for Buddhist icon to appear as if alive. In another Vinaya text translated by I-Ching in the late 7th century, the making of icon was described as analogous to gestation. The specific section is found in the 20th week of the growth of the fetus, when its skeleton begins to develop. And the text is actually quite long. I'm showing you just the section. So here is the 20th, the 20th 7 days, or the 20th week. And then there's a force in the mother that will produce or prompt the growth of the growth of fetus, of the fetus bone. And then the description starts from the feet, the toes and feet and thigh, all the way to the scalp. All right, so, and the section that is relevant to my discussion is in the red. So the part that's relevant to our text reads, and I quote, "The formation of the skeleton in the fetus may be compared to the way in which a sculptor or his disciples builds a frame with rods of strong wood, and then, after having bound those rods together with cords, applied a variety of clay to shape it into an image," end quote. The parallel between the growing of a physical body and sculpting of an icon is suggestive, considering which, for example, the so-called eye-opening ceremony performed after the completion of an icon to animate it may also be taken literally or even visually as a ritual procedure conducted to endow the icon with vision after its physical body grows fully and completely. On the contrary, destruction of icons evokes death and creates relics. In one account dated to the mid-7th century, it's actually the passage that I have right here. I'm sorry, I forgot to put the English translation right here, but the passage is from the Dao Xuan's continued biographies of eminent monk. But anyway, the term 碎身 used right here was to conjure the misery of the broken statues left behind after a monastery fell into disrepair. Broken statues grieved the faithful and were increasingly associated and imbued with ideas of death toward the period of our discussion. For example, more than 300 broken statues were uncovered in a pagoda crypt built in 1004 CE at the Mingdao Monastery in Linqu, Shandong. According to the dedicatory inscription, 2 itinerant monks stumbled onto these broken icons lying in the monastery. Saddened by the scene, they collected the fragments of statues and miraculously found thousands of relics among them. They therefore decided to donate all their money to build a pagoda crypt, so those, and I quote, "abandoned forms of the past could be interred," end quote. Before the burial, upon seeing those broken icons, all the faithful were recorded to be, and I quote again, "holding their palms together to worship and prostrating themselves on the ground weeping," end quote, as if at a funeral. In fact, the breaking and brokenness of the icon's material body were often taken around this period as enacting the moment of Buddha's death and cremation. In complete history of the Liao or Quan Liao Wen, two separate accounts report a local ritual of cremation dedicated to Buddha's death and celebrating his entry into nirvana. In both accounts, a statue of the reclining Shakyamuni at his deathbed was made of paper before the ritual. As one account states, and I quote, "For the statue, straws were used for its bones, paper for its flesh, and color for its skin," end quote. The statues were then cremated, recording the breaking of the Buddha's body. And in each case, small bits of relics were found in the cremated ashes of the statue. A pagoda was subsequently built to enshrine the relics produced by the material icon. In all above examples, the division between the corporeal body and material icon was increasingly blurred, and broken icons became inextricably tied with both the notion and entity of broken body relics. The breakage of the icon promised the shift of the corporeal imagination from the living to dead. More specifically, from Qingzhou hoard, researchers have been able to reassemble several image studies from a dozen to 100 and more of uncovered broken pieces. So here you can see, this is actually pretty complete. So all the broken pieces were there. And this one is the one I went to see last year. The researchers told me that altogether there were about 200 pieces they found together and then put them together into this complete one. So it's not 100% complete, but it's almost there. So you can think about how amazing all the pieces were there for them to piece them together. So the effort in burying all pieces of broken statues in the hoard is revealing. It is improbable that the broken parts had all been kept together for centuries before their burial during the Northern Song dynasty. Rather, I will argue it is more likely that several large statues and studies were intentionally shattered into fragments at the time of their interment, suggesting a procedure taken deliberately to turn icons into broken bodies. So turn icons into relics so they can be put in the crypt. So once broken, the former sacred icon was in an ontological limbo. But this ontological crisis would not have been noted if the broken icon was perceived only in terms of its factual material property. The bodily imagination and implications the broken icons could still solicit, thus turn them into broken body relics to be buried or cremated or enshrined in a pagoda crypt that provided them with a new physical context and conceptual framework. It is in this new context and framework that I suggest we will be able to begin to explore or uncover a different ontology of broken statues. Yet first of all, what exactly is the space of the pagoda crypt? A pagoda crypt was a structure built at the foundation level and later also above ground inside the main body of the pagoda from the 10th century onwards. As I have argued elsewhere, the underground pagoda crypt became increasingly larger and its space closer to that of a human burial throughout the Tang Dynasty. A primary example for our purpose is the pagoda crypt at Fa Wang Monastery in Dengfeng, Henan, dated to the late 9th century or early 10th. The underground crypt consists of a sloping ramp, corridor, and a brick chamber, closed off by a stone partition engraved with two female attendants. All these elements closely resemble those built for a burial. Inside the crypt is a centrally located altar on which, instead of a reliquary one usually finds, sits a clay icon of a deceased Buddhist master. So here is the location of the altar, and there's a section so you can see the side of it. And here is the image of the crypt, so you can see the statues right here. The statue is likely what has been known as a bone ash statue, or 骨灰像, made by mixing the cremated ashes of the deceased with clay. Placed inside the crypt, the relic molded in the deceased master's likeness was certainly not for memorial purposes. Instead, the relic of the master seems to have regained the bodily presence and literally embodied the central position of the space inside the crypt, as did the image of the tomb master inside a burial. Likewise, relics of miraculous finds enshrined in the pagoda crypt also take a similar bodily sense with somatic connotations. A Northern Song pagoda crypt in Jiangsu was discovered containing a set of nested reliquaries. So you are seeing right here is the outermost reliquary made in stone, and inside it is a silver reliquary and a gold reliquary. The outermost stone reliquary at the bottom is engraved with the scene of the Buddha on his deathbed. So it's the lower part right there. So you can see I have a little red lines to mark the area. So the outermost stone reliquary is engraved with the scene of the Buddha on his deathbed, accompanied by his saddened disciples. Among the disciples, a kneeling monk at the end of the bed can be seen touching the Buddha's feet. This refers to the first miracle performed by the Buddha after his death, when he stretched out his feet to greet his senior disciple, Mahakashyapa, who arrived late to venerate the Buddha's body. Interestingly, inside this stone reliquary, the silver coffin-shaped reliquary's short feet side, refers to this side right here, is engraved with an image of Buddha's feet, depicted at a slight angle and gilded with gold. The feet appear vividly, seemingly to enact the miracle by stretching and emerging from inside. If we take this corporeal connotation seriously, I should argue it was the presence rather than absence of the body that characterized the development of relic worship during our period. This emphasis on the presence of body inside the pagoda crypt, moreover, was related to another new element. Recent scholarship points to a rising trend of using an image of nirvana inside the pagoda crypt that was pervasive from the 10th through the 12th century. Instead of the entire narrative of Shakyamuni's death and funeral based on the Nirvana Sutra, according to scholars, it is the moment of his entry into nirvana, represented by the body of the reclining Buddha, that was emphasized and portrayed, as seen on the north wall of the crypt inside Jingzhou Cloister Pagoda in Dingzhou, Hebei, dated to 995. I don't know if you can see right here. That's the image. If you can see here, you can see better this way. And so the reclining pose of the Buddha thus makes an interesting contrast with the whole body relics of mummified monks preserved in a sitting posture. Whereas the integral body of the mummified monk was itself the evidence of attaining Buddhahood, the reclining Buddha signifies the body that was to be broken, whereby relics could be obtained. And I'm going to give you another example. It's quite a little bit different. So here you have the crypt right here, and inside the crypt you have reliquary. Inside the reliquary you have this reclining Buddha, right? So that's the reclining Buddha signifies the moment of cremation. And after cremation, it creates relics. That's a sign of nirvana. So turning it around, it's actually the opening right here. And this is a reliquary inside which relics were found. Right? So that's kind of the moment right there. So it's about to transform into relics. So the pagoda crypt was thus built to evoke the broader concept of nirvana as the ultimate sign of spiritual attainment by highlighting the moment when the body was to transform into relic, or the broken body. And it may have been in this context that broken statues as broken bodies were gradually incorporated into the assemblage of relic depositories. An example that testifies to the making and complexity of the pagoda crypt is one located in Fangshan, outside Beijing, in the Liao territory. Completed in 1051, the pagoda crypt at the foundation is a 1 square meter space, and at the center of this rather restrained space is a stone reliquary that contained an assembly of 33 items, including a stone statue of reclining Buddha together with bits of relics inside a pouch. A Dharani pillar, or Jingchuang, was placed on top of the crypt to seal and protect the sacred locale with its magic spells. Finally, around the Dharani pillars were 16 broken statues, some of them you are seeing right here, that framed the underground crypt as a space of the broken body. Unfortunately, no photo of the crypt was published, but but a similar arrangement of broken statues can be seen in an above-ground crypt inside the Hongfo pagoda in present-day Ningxia of the Xixia period. So the location of the above-ground crypt is right here. So it's around this area. And after it was opened, that's a photo taken then. So you can see right here, there's a lot of heads right here and a torso right there. Interestingly, among the broken heads, some retain dripping traces of greenish pigments that mark their eyes. As no other similar examples have been reported, we can only speculate about the possible intention of the markings. At least 3 broken torsos, you can see right here, and I'm going to give you one detail, were found containing sutra texts inside their hollow interior, indicating the insertion of sacred texts, which is one of the primary procedures for consecrating the icon. When uncovered, however, all the inserted texts had burned traces that may have been caused by either fire or smoke. It is highly improbable that the texts were already burned before their insertion. It seems more likely that the inserted texts were burned intentionally to deconsecrate the icons. Similarly, considering the importance of dotting the eyes in the eye-opening ritual to bringing icons to life, it is plausible that these dripping marks over the eyes may have been applied in the rite of closing the eyes, which, like their broken body, would necessarily deconsecrate their sacrality, cancel their previous functions, and change their ontology. So returning to Qingzhou Horde, one remaining question is precisely an ontological one. Why did monastics decide to bury broken statues, and what did they do in the hidden crypt? Some scholars have proposed that after ceasing to fulfill their original function, the broken statues were interred in a crypt on the monastic ground for a holy burial. This likening of the interment of broken statues to that of tomb burial can be justified in both conception and actual practice. Conceptually, making a living icon is to resurrect and mortify at the same time. Broken statues may thus indicate the demise of icon. In practice, the massive image hoards such as the one in Qingzhou or Linzhang, as suggested by scholars, may have been created for such a purpose. On the other hand, if broken icons were considered literally as broken body relics, as argued in this presentation, the death of the image may not be the end, but a necessary point of departure for broken icons to transition into a different ontology. To see this, I suggest that a few key points regarding the broken icons should be taken into account. First, most of the broken statues were not interred alone, but as part of a greater assemblage of a relic depository. This will include relics of different forms, such as bodily relics, Shen Sheng She Li, Dharma relics, Fa Shen She Li, in addition to broken icons, as well as ritual articles, offerings, dedicatory texts, and so on. It is the entire assemblage that made the interior of the crypt, providing the complete framework for the broken icons. In this framework, broken icons were thus commensurable with the canonical categories of bodily relics and Dharma relics. Second, in this framework, being incomplete or imperfect was the primary concept that defined relics, such as cremated remains or body parts, incomplete scriptures or canjing, and broken icons. Yet, as bodily relics could be perceived as true body or zhenshen, and partial scriptures could stand for the totality of the teaching, broken icon seems to suggest a greater and material presence of the divine with its bodily form. The very incompleteness thus was the premise on which the promised sacred transformation could be achieved. Third, this incompleteness to be transformed also assured that the assemblage of relic deposits be concealed in a sacred and secret space inside the pagoda crypt. Unlike the whole body relics intended for public veneration, the relic depository inside the crypt was meant to be hidden or cang, an intention critical to Chinese mortuary practice that ascertains the presence of the deceased secured in a transformative space. The use of nested reliquaries for bodily relics, either in the form of coffin-shaped reliquaries, the set on your right, as we have seen earlier, or a miniature pagoda, the set on your left, accentuates the sense of secrecy and interiority. In comparison, broken icons, though not nested in a case, seem to have taken the crypt as their innermost reliquary, thus turning the pagoda into a larger virtual reliquary. Indeed, the broken statues may be best studied as the content in relation to the pagoda as the container, or interior to exterior. As broken body relics, broken icons materialized the fundamental meaning of relics inside the crypt by adding an iconic presence, and their greater antiquity may have also increased the sacrality and enhanced the power of the sacred center inside the pagoda. To a great extent, the relic deposit inside the pagoda crypt shares many characteristics of the sacred deposit prepared to be placed inside icons, a practice also studied around this time in China and later spread to Japan, as exemplified by the 7th century bronze head on your left, found inside a 15th century statue in Kofuji in Nara, or the Edo period Akushi Nyorai on the right, which served as a reliquary for a broken Buddha head of the Kamakura period. The broken icon concealed inside, in turn, was taken as the potent agency that could empower the new icon, the structuring a symbiotic relation between the container and the content. Both the Japanese examples are too late to be a direct reference, but we should be reminded that in East Asian Buddhism, the essential meaning of the pagoda is an architectural body that contains relics. Like the broken head that inhabits the interior of the new statue, the broken bodies in our case, with their material form and corporeal implications, provided the hidden presence of the sacred that sanctified the monastic ground in which they were buried, and empowered the pagoda inside which they were enshrined, thus making the ultimate spiritual attainment, that of nirvana, much more perceivable and understandable. So in conclusion, doctrinally, the cosmic principle regarded as the true nature of the Buddha is not limited in specific material form or function. The flesh body of the Buddha was therefore only the expedient device of teaching in order to reveal the transient and corruptible nature of the world, including the Buddha's body. As a signifier of his final dissolution, the relic of the Buddha obtained only after his flesh body was cremated, thus evoke none other than the true body, that is, the true reality of the Buddha or Dhammakaya, whose eternal existence defies a physical form. The pagoda crypt in this regard is necessarily a disembodied space, and as such, the bodily presence of the broken icon that literally realize the broken body relics seems to run diametrically to the canon and principle of the body and relics in Buddhism. Yet this literal materialization in somatic terms of something transcendent and immaterial was hardly unique during the period when burying of broken statues was widely practiced. For instance, in a group of Liao tombs located in present-day Hebei and Inner Mongolia, all dated to the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the tomb master is presented in a full-size mannequin with movable joints, and its face crafted with lifelike and individualized details. Cremated human remains were found inside both the scalp and the back of mannequin, suggesting a cremation performed according to the Buddhist practice. Contradictory to the spirit of Buddhism, this reconstituted body was reinstated in the tomb as the actual presence of the dead. Closely related to this mannequin burial are the several contemporaneous tombs of the Liao royal members, in which the deceased was dressed in an elaborate set of metal body attire, consisting of a body mesh netting, gilded silk boots and crown, and a face mask. The hammered gold sheet of the face mask is gracefully slim, such that its flexibility seems to fit and capture the deceased's physiognomy tangibly. The metal body thus rendered the corporeal one ephemeral, and yet sustains its presence in a new material substance. Indeed, body matters around this historical period, even in the most unlikely space of the dead, intended to transcend the corporeal world. This enthusiasm with sensible materiality viewed as a medium for the disclosure of spiritual presence I should argue, precipitated a movement in Buddhism toward a more tangible and palpable piety that undermined the ontological separation between matter and spirit in the conception of icons. An icon could be invested with divine power and a sense of life, as mentioned earlier, by either the eye-opening ritual or interior insertion of sacred objects. In an example of the life-size wooden statue known as Udayana Shakyamuni, sculpted in China in 985 and kept since in Seiryoji, Japan, a cavity was found in the back of the statue, tightly packed with sacred treasures. Among many ritual articles and woodblock prints and texts are mark organs made of textiles. These mark organs were fabricated meticulously to differentiate the model viscera by shape, textile, and color, such that they should be perceived as simulacra of their human counterparts. The sensuous apprehension of the divine in a material human form entails a reconception of the icon in its very thinness that could be engaged and celebrated in non-idolatrous fashion. This material turn of this period thus recognized the importance of the corporeal and material world without negating its potential as sign, form, or embodiment of the divine. It also gave rise to a fascination with spirits or ghosts of objects that can be observed in literature, fiction, and drama, or funerals of professional tools, gadgets, and ritual paraphernalia in Japanese memorial services for objects. This turn to materiality of things helped the Chinese and Japanese alike of this period comprehend the unseen world and concurrently shape the ways in which the material world was comprehended. The broken body discussed in this presentation thus challenges us to reconsider the notion of and discourse of the body, relic, and icon with their interrelatedness and in terms of their material status and substance as a signifier of the divine presence. The fact that the icon could not be potent without being initiated and could die through breakage also begs for a redefinition of an icon that takes into account the cultural and religious life and materiality. In this regard, the breaking of statues should be regarded as a mode of cultural production that transforms them from living icons into a very different kind of sacred objects with their iconic meanings redefined in a very different physical context and conceptual framework. Indeed, the death of icons signifies not the terminus, but only a moment in the ongoing process of their changing ontology. That's all my talk. Thank you. Thank you.